Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling confused? Not angry, not exactly hurt, just unsure about what just happened. Maybe someone twisted your words. Maybe they made you doubt your own memory. Or maybe they somehow turned themselves into the victim, even though you were the one who was hurt. And later, when you try to explain it to someone else, it sounds strange. Because on the surface, nothing obvious happened. No yelling, no threats, no clear manipulation. But something about it felt wrong. Psychologists say this is often how narcissistic control works. Not through obvious domination, but through subtle psychological tactics that slowly reshape how you think, feel, and respond. And the most dangerous part? Most people don't realize it's happening until they're already deeply entangled. In this video, we'll explore 5 psychological tactics narcissists use to control others without them realizing it. And once you see these patterns, you'll start noticing them everywhere. 1. The charm trap. Narcissistic control rarely begins with conflict. It begins with something far more appealing: charm. In the early stages, narcissists often appear incredibly magnetic. They seem confident, engaging, and unusually attentive. They know how to hold eye contact just a little longer, how to say exactly the right thing at the right moment, how to make someone feel like the most important person in the room. Conversations with them feel exciting, almost intoxicating. For many people, the experience feels rare and special, like they've finally met someone who truly understands them. But what makes this stage so powerful is not just the charm itself. It's the intensity of it. Narcissists often accelerate emotional closeness much faster than normal relationships develop. They may offer constant compliments, send long messages filled with admiration, or express deep interest in your life, your dreams, your struggles. Psychologists sometimes refer to this phase as love bombing, a period of overwhelming attention and affection designed to create a strong emotional bond. And on the surface, it feels wonderful. Who wouldn't enjoy feeling admired, appreciated, and valued? But behind the charm, something more strategic may be happening. Because during this stage, narcissists are not only building connection, they are also collecting information. They listen carefully when you talk about your insecurities, your fears, your past relationships, your emotional wounds. Every detail is quietly stored away, not necessarily with malicious intent in the moment, but as potential leverage later. And the more personal information someone shares, the more vulnerable they become. This is why the charm trap works so effectively. Because emotional trust is built quickly, defenses lower, and people begin opening parts of themselves they would normally protect. They begin believing the narcissist is different from everyone else. More understanding, more supportive, more emotionally connected. But over time, subtle shifts may begin to appear. The constant attention may suddenly become inconsistent. The admiration may turn into mild criticism. The person who once seemed endlessly supportive may become distant or unpredictable. And this creates confusion, because the memory of that initial charm still lingers. The victim begins wondering what changed, what they might have done wrong, and without realizing it, they start trying harder to regain the warmth that once felt so natural. More attention, more patience, more emotional effort. But that original charm was never meant to last forever. It was meant to establish something much more powerful: emotional attachment. Because once someone becomes emotionally invested, they are far more likely to overlook warning signs, excuse troubling behavior, or remain in situations they would normally question. And that is why the charm trap is often the first step in narcissistic control. It doesn't push people away, pulls them closer to someone who seems deeply caring, while quietly setting the stage for something very different. Because in many cases, the strongest chains are not built with force. They are built with flattery, attention, and emotional connection. 2. Gaslighting, the reality distortion. One of the most powerful ways narcissists control people is not through aggression, not through threats, but through something far more subtle. They begin to reshape your sense of reality. Psychologists call this tactic gaslighting. Gaslighting is a form of psychological manipulation designed to make someone question their own memory, perception, and judgment. And it often begins with small, almost invisible moments. A conversation happens one way, but later the narcissist describes it differently. You clearly remember what was said, but they insist that you're mistaken. Maybe you point out something they did, and instead of acknowledging it, they respond calmly. That never happened. Or, you're remembering it wrong. First, it feels confusing. You know what you experienced, but their confidence makes you hesitate. Maybe you misunderstood. Maybe you're exaggerating. Maybe you're just being too sensitive. And that moment of doubt is exactly where gaslighting begins to take hold. Because narcissists rarely argue loudly about reality. They calmly rewrite it. If they forget a promise, they may claim they never made it. If they hurt you, they may insist you misunderstood their intentions. If you confront them, they may accuse you of overreacting. Statements like these become common. You're being dramatic. You always twist things. You're imagining problems that don't exist. Over time, these comments start having a psychological effect. You begin replaying conversations in your head, questioning your memory, wondering if you misunderstood something that seemed clear before. And slowly a shift begins. Instead of trusting your own perception, you start looking to the narcissist for confirmation. You ask questions like, did that really happen the way I remember? Am I overthinking this? And the narcissist becomes the one providing the answers. This is the true power of gaslighting. It doesn't just change how you see them. It changes how you see yourself. Your confidence in your own thoughts begins to weaken. Your certainty fades. Your inner voice grows quieter. And when someone no longer fully trusts their own perception, they become far easier to influence. Because if you doubt your own judgment, you naturally look to someone else for guidance. Someone who seems confident, certain, and sure of their version of reality, which in this case is the narcissist. But the most dangerous part of gaslighting is how slowly it happens. It rarely begins with extreme lies. Instead, it unfolds through dozens of small distortions, small denials, small contradictions, until eventually, the victim begins to feel something deeply unsettling. A constant sense of confusion, a feeling that something is wrong, but an inability to clearly explain what it is. Friends might notice changes. You might seem more uncertain, more hesitant, more self-critical. But inside the relationship, the narcissist often continues presenting themselves as calm, logical, and reasonable, which makes it even harder to challenge them. Because if someone appears calm while you feel confused, you may start assuming the problem must be you. And that is exactly what gaslighting is designed to achieve. A situation where one person controls the narrative, while the other slowly loses confidence in their own voice. But understanding gaslighting reveals something powerful. Because manipulation loses much of its strength once it becomes visible. The moment someone begins trusting their perception again, the illusion starts to break. And once the illusion breaks, the narcissist's control over reality begins to fade. 3. The guilt web. When most people think of manipulation, they imagine aggression, anger, control through intimidation. But narcissistic control often works in the opposite way. Instead of attacking directly, narcissists frequently use something much more powerful. Guilt. Because guilt is one of the strongest emotional forces in human psychology. It makes people question themselves, apologize for things they didn't do, and take responsibility for problems that were never theirs to begin with. And narcissists know how to use this instinct very well. The pattern often begins when the victim tries to address a problem. Maybe they point out a broken promise. Maybe they express how something hurt them. In a healthy relationship, this would lead to a conversation, an attempt to understand each other. But in a narcissistic dynamic, something different happens. The conversation suddenly shifts. Instead of discussing the original issue, the narcissist redirects the emotional focus. They might respond with statements like, "After everything I've done for you, this is how you treat me?" Or, "I guess I'm just a terrible person then." First, This response feels confusing. You were trying to talk about a specific problem, but suddenly, the narcissist seems deeply hurt, and the emotional weight of the conversation changes direction. Instead of addressing the issue, you begin comforting them, trying to reassure them, trying to explain that you didn't mean to upset them. Without realizing it, the person who was hurt becomes the one apologizing. Psychologists sometimes describe this pattern as emotional inversion, where the roles in the conflict flip completely. The person responsible for the harm appears to be the victim, and the actual victim feels guilty for bringing it up. This tactic is extremely effective because most people have a strong desire to be fair. They don't want to hurt others. They don't want to appear selfish or unreasonable. So when the narcissist expresses emotional pain, even if it's exaggerated or manipulative, the victim often responds with empathy. But over time, this pattern creates a psychological trap. Every time the victim tries to set a boundary, guilt appears. Every time they raise a concern, the narcissist reacts with emotional distress. And eventually, the victim begins anticipating that reaction. They start thinking, maybe I shouldn't say anything. Maybe it's not worth the argument. Maybe I'm being too sensitive. Slowly, the act of speaking up begins to feel uncomfortable. Confrontation becomes exhausting, and silence begins to feel easier. This is how the guilt web forms, not through force, but through emotional pressure. The narcissist doesn't need to stop the victim directly. They simply make confrontation feel so emotionally draining that the victim stops trying. And when someone stops expressing their concerns, control quietly shifts in one direction. The narcissist's needs, opinions, and feelings begin dominating the relationship, while the victim's needs slowly disappear from the conversation. But the most important thing to understand about guilt manipulation is this. Healthy guilt appears when someone has actually done something wrong. Manipulated guilt appears when someone is made to feel responsible for someone else's behavior or emotions. And recognizing that difference is crucial, because once someone begins noticing the pattern, the guilt web starts to lose its power. They begin asking a different question. Not how do I avoid upsetting them, but instead, is this guilt actually mine to carry? And sometimes that simple realization is enough to begin breaking free from the web entirely. 4. Isolation through subtle influence. For someone who wants control, there is one strategy that makes everything easier. Isolation. Because the fewer outside perspectives a person has, the easier it becomes to shape their thoughts, their emotions, and their decisions. But narcissists rarely isolate someone in obvious ways. They don't usually demand that you cut people out of your life. They don't say, stop talking to your friends, or don't see your family. That would be too obvious, too suspicious. Instead, they isolate you slowly, quietly, through subtle influence. It might begin with a small comment about someone close to you, maybe a friend, maybe a sibling, maybe a coworker. At first, the remark sounds casual. Something like, I don't think they really understand you, or sometimes I feel like they're jealous of you. It might even sound protective, like the narcissist is looking out for your best interests. But these comments begin planting small seeds of doubt, seeds that grow over time. You may start noticing things you didn't notice before. Maybe a friend's joke suddenly feels like criticism. Maybe a family member's advice feels like interference. And when these moments happen, the narcissist is often ready with another subtle comment. See what I mean? They don't really support you. Slowly, the narcissist becomes the person who seems to understand you the most. The one who validates your feelings. The one who appears to be on your side. At the same time, relationships with others begin feeling more complicated, more distant, more uncertain. You may stop sharing as much with friends. You may start declining invitations. Not because anyone forced you to, but because the dynamic around those relationships has quietly changed. This is how subtle isolation works. Not through commands, but through influence. Over time, the narcissist becomes your primary emotional reference point. The person you turn to when something happens. The person whose opinion matters the most. And when one voice becomes dominant like that, something important disappears. Perspective. Friends often notice things we don't. Family members sometimes recognize patterns before we do. But when those voices fade away, it becomes much harder to see manipulation clearly. Because the only perspective left is the narcissists. And their version of events often frames them as the reasonable one, the supportive one, the misunderstood one. This dynamic creates a powerful psychological dependency. The victim begins relying on the narcissist not only for emotional connection, but also for validation, for guidance, for reassurance. And once someone reaches that point, control becomes far easier to maintain, because the outside world slowly fades into the background. The narcissist becomes the center of the emotional universe. But understanding this pattern reveals something important. Isolation is rarely about physically removing people from someone's life. It's about gradually weakening the influence those people have. And once someone recognizes that process, they can begin rebuilding those connections again. Because strong relationships with multiple perspectives create something narcissistic control cannot easily survive. Clarity. And clarity is often the first step toward breaking free from subtle influence. 5. The control of identity. The most powerful form of control doesn't happen outside a person. It happens inside their mind. Because while manipulation can influence behavior for a short time, true control begins when someone starts questioning who they are. And this is often the final stage of narcissistic influence, the gradual reshaping of a person's identity. At first, the changes are subtle. Small comments, small criticisms, small doubts introduced into the conversation. A narcissist might say something like, "You're too sensitive. You always overthink things. You're not very good at handling situations like this." On their own, these comments may seem insignificant. Everyone experiences criticism from time to time. But when these messages are repeated consistently, something deeper begins to happen. The brain starts absorbing them. At first, the victim might push back. They might defend themselves. But over time, hearing the same ideas again and again begins to create internal questions. Maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe I do overreact. Maybe I'm the one making things difficult. And once that internal doubt appears, the narcissist gains something incredibly valuable. Influence over how the victim sees themselves. Psychologists often refer to this as identity erosion, a slow process where someone's confidence, independence, and self-perception begin to weaken. And the more self-doubt grows, the more the victim begins seeking reassurance. They look for validation, for approval, for confirmation that they are doing things the right way. And the narcissist becomes the gatekeeper of that validation. Sometimes offering praise, sometimes withdrawing it, creating an emotional system where approval feels unpredictable. And unpredictability is powerful, because when validation becomes inconsistent, people often try even harder to earn it. They work harder to please, to avoid mistakes, to avoid upsetting the narcissist. Without realizing it, their sense of worth is slowly being tied to someone else's opinion. This creates a psychological loop. The narcissist damages the victim's confidence, then becomes the person who occasionally restores it, which deepens emotional dependence. But the deepest danger of identity manipulation is not the criticism itself. It's the story the victim begins telling themselves. A story that might sound like this: "I'm difficult. I'm not strong enough. I'm lucky they still care about me." And once that story takes hold, the victim may begin accepting treatment they once would have rejected, because they no longer believe they deserve better. But here's the crucial truth about identity. It is not fixed. It is not something another person has the power to permanently define. Identity is shaped by experiences, by beliefs, and by the stories we tell ourselves about our own lives, which means it can also be reclaimed. The moment someone begins questioning the negative labels placed on them, the process of recovery begins. They start remembering who they were before the manipulation, before the constant doubt, before their confidence was slowly chipped away. And once someone reconnects with that original sense of self, the narcissist's control begins to weaken, because manipulation thrives in self-doubt, but it struggles to survive in self-awareness. And the moment someone realizes their identity was never truly broken, only distorted, they take back the one thing narcissistic control depends on the most: the power to define who they are. Narcissistic control is rarely loud. It rarely looks like domination. Instead, it operates quietly, through charm, confusion, guilt, isolation, and self-doubt, which is why many people don't recognize it while it's happening. But awareness changes everything, because once you understand these psychological patterns, they become much easier to see. And when manipulation becomes visible, its power begins to fade. The most important step is remembering something simple. Healthy relationships strengthen your sense of self. They don't slowly erase it.